The silent plea. The galaxy was vast, stretching out in every direction. It was a place of chaos and beauty, but for many species, it was also a place of danger. The Velithi were one of those species. They were peaceful, fragile beings with no means of defending themselves against the constant threats that lurked in the galaxy. For generations, they had lived quietly on their homeworld, hidden away from the violence and struggles of the wider universe. But now, all that had changed. The raiders came without warning. They descended on the Velithi's planet like a storm, bringing destruction and terror with them. These raiders were merciless, ruthless in their search for anything they could steal or destroy. They didn't care who they hurt, who they killed, or who they left behind. They were only concerned with getting what they wanted, and they wanted everything. The Velithi, with their delicate bodies and unarmed cities, stood no chance against the raiders. Their technology was primitive at best, and they had no defenses to speak of. Their only hope was to send out a distress signal, a call for help, in the hopes that someone would hear it. The message was simple, desperate, and filled with fear. Helpless, the Velithi begged. "We are being attacked. We cannot defend ourselves. Please, save us." But no one came. For days they waited, watching as their homes burned, their people were taken, and their world slowly crumbled. There was no response to their signal. It seemed as though the galaxy had abandoned them. There was no one who cared enough to answer. But then, on the 5th day, something changed. A strange signal appeared on the Velithi's communication systems. At first, they didn't understand it. It was an unknown frequency, one they had never encountered before. But it was clear enough to be a message of some kind. The Velithi technicians scrambled to decode it, unsure of what they were dealing with. When the message finally came through, it was a single sentence. "We are coming." The words echoed in the silence of their broken world. It was not a voice of hope, but of cold certainty. Whoever this was, they were coming, and they were coming fast. The Velithi didn't know who these mysterious beings were, but they couldn't afford to wait any longer. They sent another message, one filled with gratitude and hope. "We need help. Please hurry." But would anyone truly come? Would anyone care enough to save them? The Velithi were terrified. They knew they had no choice but to wait and pray that someone would answer their call. Unknown to the Velithi, the message had already been received far away, across a galaxy full of danger and mystery. The beings who had received the call were not like any the Velithi had ever known. They were feared throughout the galaxy. They were strong, ruthless, and unyielding. They were Deathworlders. The Deathworlders were known to be the most powerful species in the galaxy. Their warriors were legends, feared by even the most powerful empires. They had never shown interest in helping others, but their reputation as merciless fighters was unmatched. They were known for their skill, strength, and their complete lack of mercy for anyone who threatened them. When they chose to fight, they fought to win, and they never backed down. For the Deathworlders, the call for help from the Velithi was nothing more than a simple choice. They had no love for the weak, but they understood the value of a challenge. The Velithi may have been fragile and defenseless, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the one thing the galaxy had underestimated. The Deathworlders did not let anyone suffer without paying the price. As the Deathworlder fleet moved toward the Velithi's world, the galaxy held its breath. No one knew why the Deathworlders had chosen to respond to a plea for help. Some feared it was just another show of force, another way to remind the galaxy of their power. But others wondered if the Deathworlders had changed, if they were, for once, showing compassion. The Deathworlders had arrived, and their ship's engines roared through space like thunder. As they neared the Velithi's planet, the first wave of their fleet dropped out of hyperspace, creating a bright flash of light in the sky above the burning world. They came with a force no one could comprehend, giant warships, heavily armed, and prepared for anything. The Velithi watched as the sky above them filled with the silhouettes of the ships. Their hope began to rise, but it was mixed with fear. Who were these beings? Were they here to help them, or were they simply another force coming to take what little they had left? The Velethi had already been betrayed once by the galaxy, and they weren't sure if they could trust anyone anymore. But as the Deathworlder ships began to land, their immense size blocking out the sun, the Velethi knew something was different this time. The Deathworlders didn't just come to fight. They came to defend. And for the first time in days, the Velethi dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone out there cared. The Velethi watched in awe as the massive ships hovered over their planet. The skies above their world, which had once been filled with the sounds of destruction and despair, were now filled with the hum of enormous engines. The ships cast long shadows across the broken landscape, their sleek, menacing forms unlike anything the Velethi had ever seen. For days, they had been surrounded by the terrifying chaos of their attackers. The raiders had come without warning, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. The Velethi had tried to resist, but they were no match for the merciless invaders. Their cities were in ruins, their people scattered or captured, and their world was on the brink of being lost forever. But now, the situation had changed. The Velethi's hope, once extinguished, had flickered back to life with the arrival of the Deathworlders. The ships that filled the sky were a sign that help had finally arrived, though no one could have imagined who this help would come from. The Velethi had heard rumors about the Deathworlders. They were the stuff of legends, creatures of myth and fear. The most powerful species in the galaxy, they were known for their brutal strength and unmatched combat skills. It was said that they had come from the harshest, most dangerous worlds in existence, where only the strongest could survive. They were feared by all, respected by few, and never once had they been seen as saviors. But as the Velethi watched the ships descend, they realized that this time, the Deathworlders were here for a reason. These cold, ruthless warriors had chosen to come to their aid. The first wave of ships landed with a deafening crash, shaking the ground beneath the Velethi's feet. Massive doors opened, revealing the warriors who would decide the fate of their world. The Deathworlders were a sight to behold. Tall, muscular, with an air of lethal confidence. They wore armor that seemed to shimmer in the light, reflecting the harsh, red glow of the Velethi's dying sun. Their eyes burned with intensity, and the Velethi could sense that these warriors were not to be trifled with. At the front of the group stood their leader, a figure so imposing that even the Velethi, who had never known true fear, could not help but shudder. His name was Kale, and his reputation had preceded him across the galaxy. Kale was known as the Deathbringer, a title earned through countless battles fought and won. His people followed him without question, trusting in his strength and his unyielding will to conquer anything that stood in his path. Kale stepped forward, his heavy boots leaving deep impressions in the cracked earth with each stride. The Velethi watched in silence as he surveyed the ruined city before him, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the devastation. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The Velethi could hardly breathe, unsure of what was to come. They had sent out a call for help, but they never expected this, never expected the very creatures they had heard of in whispers to arrive in such force. Cal's gaze moved over the survivors, his expression unreadable. He spoke, his voice deep and commanding, cutting through the still air like a blade. "We are here to protect you," he said, his words simple but filled with undeniable power. "Do not fear. The raiders will not leave this planet alive." The Velethi could hardly believe their ears. These warriors, these legendary figures, were here to fight for them, to save them from the horrors they had endured. It seemed impossible, but the presence of the Deathworlders, their sheer power, made it all feel real. As Kale gave the order, his warriors moved quickly, efficiently. They began to deploy heavy weaponry, setting up defensive perimeters around the city. The Velethi watched in stunned silence as the Deathworlders worked with practiced ease, setting traps for the raiders and positioning themselves for battle. The warriors moved like one well-oiled machine, and the Velethi could see that the Deathworlders were ready for whatever the raiders had in store. And then, The first signs of the raiders appeared on the horizon. The sky darkened as their ships appeared, their engines roaring as they descended toward the city. The raiders had no idea what awaited them. They thought they had already conquered the Velethi. They thought the planet was theirs for the taking. But they were about to learn the harsh truth that the galaxy's most fearsome warriors had come to reclaim what was theirs. Kale and his warriors stood at the ready, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. They didn't flinch as the raiders' ships landed, their engines screeching as they touched down. The raiders, confident in their victory, disembarked with weapons raised high, ready to strike down anyone who dared to stand in their way. But the Deathworlders were not afraid. As the raiders charged, Kale stepped forward, his hand raised in a single commanding gesture. The warriors followed his lead, charging into battle with a ferocity that took the raiders by surprise. The Velethi watched in awe as the Deathworlders tore through the raiders with ease, their strength and skill overwhelming the attackers at every turn. The sound of battle echoed through the air, but the Velethi could not take their eyes off the Deathworlders. They were a force of nature, unstoppable, fierce, and ruthless. It was clear that the raiders had underestimated the power of the galaxy's most feared warriors. In the end, the raiders were no match for the Deathworlders. Within hours, the last of them had been defeated, and the battlefield was littered with the remnants of their ships. The city, which had once been on the brink of total destruction, was now safe. The Velethi were safe. The warriors stood in the aftermath, their expressions grim but satisfied. Kale looked over the ruined city once more, his gaze softer now. He had fulfilled his mission, but there was still work to be done. He turned to his warriors, giving them the signal to start rebuilding. The Deathworlders were not just here to fight. They were here to protect and to ensure that the Velethi had a future. As the Deathworlder fleet began to prepare to leave, the Velethi gathered around, their gratitude overflowing. They had been saved by the very creatures they had feared. The warriors who had come to their aid were not just powerful. They were honorable, willing to risk everything to defend the weak. The Velethi would never forget the Deathworlders, not for their strength, but for the compassion they had shown in the face of unimaginable odds. The galaxy had learned a powerful lesson that day. Even the strongest warriors could be the most compassionate, and sometimes the greatest strength lies in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Deathworlders had saved them, and in doing so, they had forever changed the Velethi's view of the galaxy. No longer would they see it as a place of danger and despair. The galaxy, they now understood, was a place where even the most unexpected heroes could rise to the occasion. And as the Deathworlder ships lifted off and disappeared into the stars, the Velethi knew one thing for certain. They would never again feel truly helpless. The Velethi watched from their shattered city as the Deathworlders prepared for the next phase of the battle. The horizon was now thick with smoke and the heavy scent of fire, remnants of the raider ships that had fallen in the wake of the Deathworlder onslaught. The invaders had been ruthless, but they were no match for the warriors from the Deathworlds, whose power and precision were unmatched. Despite the battle's victory, the Velethi knew this was only the beginning. The raiders may have been beaten back, but their leader, the ruthless Commander Vrax, was still at large, and they knew from experience that he would return. Vrax would not simply give up. His ambition and hunger for power were insatiable. The Deathworlders' intervention had been a godsend, but it was clear that the fight was far from over. Kale, the leader of the Deathworlders, stood among his warriors, his gaze unwavering as he scanned the horizon. The battle had been intense, but he knew that it was just the beginning of a larger conflict. He had known the risks when he accepted the mission to help the Velethi. The galaxy was full of powerful enemies, and sometimes even the mightiest warriors had to fight for survival. As the Deathworlder fleet prepared to launch another strike against the remaining raiders, Kal's mind worked quickly, considering the next steps. He knew they had to act fast. Vrax would not sit idly by. He would rally his forces, and they would come back with even more firepower. The Deathworlders had already proven their might. But now it was time to outsmart the invaders. "We must move quickly," Kale said, his voice deep and steady. His warriors turned their attention to him, ready for his orders. "We take the fight to them," Kale continued. "The Velathi cannot remain in this city any longer. Their survival depends on us now. We'll strike where they least expect it." The warriors nodded in agreement, their faces grim. They had faced death countless times, but this mission was different. It was more than just about survival. It was about protecting the innocent, about saving a world that had been torn apart by the very enemies they had just fought. Meanwhile, the Velathi leaders met in secret, away from the eyes of the Deathworlders. Though they were grateful for the warriors' intervention, they still feared what the future might hold. They had seen the power of the raiders, and they knew that they could not rely on the Deathworlders forever. It was time for their people to fight for their own survival. "We can't just sit back and wait for the Deathworlders to save us," said one of the Velathi commanders, his voice trembling with both fear and resolve. "We must do our part. If we don't take action, we risk losing everything." The others nodded in agreement. They had never been warriors, but they knew their planet better than anyone. They had the knowledge of the terrain, the lay of the land. They could help the Deathworlders in ways the outsiders couldn't. A plan was formed, one that would see the Velathi fighting side by side with the Deathworlders. Though they were not warriors, they would have to become something more if they wanted to survive. The future of their species depended on it. As the Deathworlder fleet prepared for its next assault, the Velathi warriors took their places alongside the battle-hardened Deathworlders. It was a partnership forged by necessity, one built on mutual respect for the will to survive. Together, they would stand against Vrax and his merciless raiders. The raider ships had already begun to regroup, and they were preparing to strike once more. Cal's eyes narrowed as he watched their movements on the scanners. The raiders were predictable, but they were not without cunning. They had learned from their earlier defeat, and Cal knew they would strike harder this time. "The battle will not be easy," Cal said to his warriors, his voice low but firm. "Vrax will come with everything he has. We need to be ready. We strike now, and we strike fast." The Deathworlders readied their weapons, checking their gear and preparing their assault strategies. The Velathi, now emboldened by the presence of the Deathworlders, were eager to fight, even though they had never held a weapon in their hands before. They were learning quickly, their eyes burning with a determination to protect their world. As the raiders launched their attack, the Deathworlders and Velathi fought side by side. The Deathworlders moved with precision, their battle tactics honed from years of surviving on the harshest planets in the galaxy. Their weapons blazed, tearing through raider ships and sending them crashing to the ground. The Velathi, though inexperienced, fought with a raw, desperate energy. They knew their world was at stake. They had to push forward, had to stand their ground if they wanted to preserve their way of life. The battle raged for hours, the sound of explosions and gunfire filling the air. It was chaos, but it was a chaos the Deathworlders thrived in. They fought without hesitation, their bodies moving like fluid machines, each strike landing with deadly accuracy. The Velathi followed their lead, using the tools they had been taught to defend themselves, learning as they fought. In the midst of the battle, Kale and his warriors led the charge. They moved like shadows, each step bringing them closer to Vrax's command ship, the heart of the raider forces. The Velathi were close behind, ready to take down anything that stood in their way. And then, just as it seemed like the tide of battle would turn in their favor, Vrax's ship rose from the wreckage. The massive vessel loomed above them, its dark hull casting a menacing shadow over the battlefield. Vrax had returned, and he was not alone. His forces had regrouped, and they were more powerful than before. The final confrontation was imminent. The Deathworlders' time had come. It was now or never. As Kale looked up at the enemy ship, he knew there was no turning back. This would be the ultimate test, a battle for the survival of the Velathi, and for the Deathworlders' honor. The fight for survival was not over. It had only just begun. The moment the shadow of Vrax's ship cast over the battlefield, the ground seemed to tremble. The Velethi, despite their growing courage, felt a chill run through them. They had seen the strength of the raiders' forces, but this was a different level of danger. Vrax had returned, not just with a renewed army, but with a burning desire to crush everything in his path. The Deathworlders, however, were not intimidated. Kel's gaze hardened as he surveyed the enemy's ship, and his warriors stood tall, unwavering. They had come this far to protect the Velethi, and would not allow this galaxy-crushing force to break their spirit. Their bodies were tired, their minds sharpened by the countless battles they had fought before. But this moment, the final push, would require every ounce of their strength. "Prepare yourselves," Kel called out to his warriors, his voice deep and commanding. "This is where we end this. We fight together, for every inch of this planet." His words carried weight, stirring the warriors. They had come from far-flung death worlds where survival was a brutal, unyielding challenge. No enemy, no matter how mighty, would bend their will. On the other side of the battlefield, Vrax stood tall in his command chamber, staring down at the planet below. He could see the Deathworlder fleet preparing for their final assault, and he knew this was their last stand. But his eyes burned with fury. He had never underestimated an enemy before, and he wouldn't start now. He would tear through them and show them the true cost of defiance. "I want every ship ready," Vrax barked, his voice cold as ice. "This world will burn, and nothing will stop me." The raiders' ships, having regrouped and reinforced their firepower, began to power up. Massive energy shields glowed around their hulls, and their weapon systems locked into place. The skies above the Velethi city darkened as their fleet hovered ominously, ready to unleash hell. Kel's warriors took their positions, their weapons primed. They knew that in a battle like this, every decision, every moment, counted. There was no room for mistakes. "Now, move," Kel ordered. The Deathworlders surged forward, their movements a blur of precision and power. The air rippled with the hum of their advanced weaponry as they launched their first wave of strikes. The raider ships above the city began to fall, their shields flickering as the Deathworlder weapons tore through their defenses. Explosions rippled through the air, sending debris tumbling to the ground. However, Vrax's forces were not weak. His ships retaliated immediately, releasing a barrage of fire that lit up the sky. The Deathworlders were fast and agile, dodging and weaving through the oncoming fire, but the intensity of the battle escalated by the second. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire, explosions, and the deep, rattling thrum of ship engines. The Deathworlder fleet moved with deadly grace, their ships darting between the raider vessels, launching their devastating strikes. Their weapons hit with pinpoint accuracy, crippling the raider fleet one ship at a time. However, Vrax's ship remained largely unharmed. It was massive and heavily fortified. And as the battle raged on, the Deathworlders found themselves having to focus more on defending their own ships from the relentless assault. "Focus fire on Vrax's command ship," Kel shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We take him down, and the rest will fall." The warriors responded swiftly, redirecting their fire towards the heart of the enemy fleet. They knew that without Vrax's command ship, the rest of the raider forces would crumble. But the enemy was far from done. The command ship fired back with furious intensity, its own weapons raining down on the Deathworlder fleet. Kel watched as the enemy fire hit one of his ships, sending it spiraling out of control. His heart tightened, but he knew this was the price of war. The warriors under his command were used to loss, but they were also driven by an unyielding resolve. They would not fail. The Velethi, though not fighters, had prepared as best they could. They had fortified their cities, and their once fragile spirit had been hardened by the constant threats they faced. Now, standing alongside the Deathworlders, they took up whatever weapons they could find. Some manned the defenses, while others worked to evacuate civilians to safer ground. One Velithi commander, in particular, had taken it upon himself to protect the weak. Though he had no formal combat training, he was determined not to let his people be slaughtered without a fight. He joined the Deathworlders at the front lines, his movements shaky but filled with courage. "This is our planet," he said, his voice shaking but strong. "We fight for it, no matter the cost." The Velithi, inspired by his words, began to take up arms, helping where they could. They didn't have the brute strength of the Deathworlders, but their ingenuity and determination made them valuable allies. They started setting up traps, launching surprise attacks, and weakening the raiders' flank, making it harder for them to get close to the city. But Vrax, seeing the shift in the tide, grew angrier. His once confident posture was now tinged with frustration. His fleet, though powerful, was starting to buckle under the combined force of the Deathworlders and the Velithi. Kel could sense the shift. His warriors were tireless, their resilience beginning to turn the battle in their favor, but they could not afford to let up. "We break their resolve now," Kale bellowed. "We finish this." With a renewed fury, the Deathworlders unleashed everything they had, launching a coordinated attack on Vrax's command ship. The air was thick with energy blasts as their combined firepower created a deadly storm. The raider fleet began to fall into disarray, many ships spiraling into flames as their shields failed. Finally, the moment came. With a decisive blow, the Deathworlder fleet's largest ship fired its final shot, reaching the shields of Vrax's command ship. The explosion was deafening, and the ship crumpled into itself, a massive fireball that lit up the night sky. The raiders' morale shattered. Without their leader, they faltered, their coordination crumbling. The Deathworlder fleet, sensing victory, intensified their assault, finishing off the remaining ships. Vrax was gone. The battle was over. As the Deathworlders stood victorious, they turned to the Velithi, their allies who had fought alongside them, now battered but alive. The planet was saved, but the war had left its scars. Yet in the silence that followed, there was a quiet sense of triumph. The strongest had defended the weakest, and the galaxy had watched in awe. The Velithi were free. The galaxy would remember this day. The Deathworlders had once again proven that no enemy was too powerful when united with the right cause. The battle had ended, and the silent night sky now seemed almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. The planet's surface was still smoldering in places where debris and remnants of fallen ships lay scattered. The echoes of the battle were fading, but the heavy toll it had taken on both sides was impossible to ignore. The Deathworlders stood victorious, their fleet battered but unbroken. Their warriors, though bloodied and bruised, had triumphed. Kale stood at the forefront of the battlefield, looking out over the planet. His mind was sharp, calculating the damage done. The Deathworlders had won, but it came at a cost. He had seen too many of his comrades fall, their sacrifice carved into the landscape like deep scars. It was a victory, yes, but one that weighed heavily on his heart. Around him, the Deathworlders gathered, their voices low and somber. No one cheered. They didn't celebrate the death of their enemies. Instead, they mourned their own losses. The Velithi, though inexperienced in combat, had proven to be resilient. Many of them had stood by the Deathworlders, fighting against impossible odds. Kale knew their bravery had played a crucial role in the victory, but in his heart, he knew the real cost of war. Too many lives lost in the name of survival. "We did what we had to," Kale murmured to his closest lieutenant, a warrior named Makar, who had fought by his side since the beginning of this campaign. Makar nodded solemnly, his armor scorched and dented. "We did. But at what cost, Kale? Look at the damage. How many more battles like this can we fight?" Kale glanced over at the horizon, where the once pristine landscapes were now marred by the remnants of war. His mind wandered to the Deathworlds they had come from, where survival was an unforgiving struggle. But this was different. They weren't fighting just to survive anymore. They were fighting for something bigger, They were fighting for others. It's the price of protecting the weak. Kale replied softly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The galaxy owes us nothing, but we owe the Velethi everything. The Deathworlders had not come to this planet seeking glory or riches. They had come to protect a people who had been pushed to the edge of extinction by a much stronger force. Vrax's raiders had been merciless, and the galaxy had watched in silence as entire systems fell under their control. But the Deathworlders were different. They didn't stand idly by. "We will rebuild," Kale said, turning to face Makar. "The Velethi are our allies now. They fought bravely. We owe them the same dedication." Makar's gaze softened. "You think they'll want to join us after all this? Will they understand what we've done for them?" "They will," Kale said with certainty. "We are not like the raiders who came before. We fight for honor, for respect. We don't conquer, we protect. And in the end, that is what will bring us allies, not enemies." The Velethi leaders, who had watched the battle unfold from a safe distance, now began to approach the Deathworlders, cautiously but with newfound respect. Their commander, the one who had fought alongside them despite not being a fighter, stepped forward, his face weary but resolute. "You've done it," he said, his voice hoarse. "The raiders are gone, and we're free. We'll never forget what you've done for us." Kale nodded. "We didn't do it for thanks. We did it because we don't stand by while the strong prey on the weak. You fought with us. That makes you more than just allies. Your family." The Velethi commander's expression softened. "We will help you rebuild. We will stand with you. The galaxy will know that we are no longer helpless." The Deathworlders and the Velethi worked together to clear the wreckage, gathering the wounded and organizing what remained of their forces. As they did so, they began to rebuild the cities that had been damaged in the battle. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. Back at their base, Kale stood with Makar and the other warriors, watching the first steps of reconstruction. "We've earned their trust," Makar said, "but there's still more to be done." "There always will be," Kale replied, his voice steady. "The galaxy is vast, and it's not done with us yet." As the Deathworlders and the Velethi joined forces in rebuilding, the message of their victory spread across the galaxy. The once silent systems now buzzed with news of the brave warriors who had stood up for those too weak to defend themselves. The Deathworlders had proven that no matter how powerful the enemy, they would fight to the last breath for what was right. And in the end, it was their strength, their unity, and their honor that had won the day. But Kale knew the true cost of victory. The battle had been won, but the war for peace was far from over. There were still threats out there, other factions that sought to dominate and crush those who couldn't fight back. But the Deathworlders would be ready. They had seen what unity could accomplish, and they would not stop until the galaxy was a safer place for those who needed protection the most. In the weeks that followed, the Deathworlders' influence began to grow. The Velethi were no longer the only ones to seek their aid. Other systems, oppressed and under the thumb of cruel warlords and tyrants, began to send emissaries to the Deathworlders, asking for help. Kale looked out at the stars, the vastness of the galaxy stretching before him. "We've only just begun," he murmured. "There are many more to protect, and we'll do it, no matter the cost." The Deathworlders had shown that they were more than just warriors. They were the guardians of the galaxy's most vulnerable, the unyielding force that would never back down, no matter how many enemies stood in their way. And as long as they stood together, no one would ever be able to break their resolve. The galaxy would remember the day the strongest warriors defended the weakest, and in that memory they would find hope. Hope that no matter how dark things seemed, there would always be those willing to fight for a better future. The galaxy was changing. What had once been a place of endless conflict and division was slowly becoming something else. The Deathworlders had not only proven their might in battle, but they had also shown a new path forward for the galaxy. A path where strength was not just about conquering, but about protecting. a path where the strong did not rule over the weak, but fought to give them a chance to thrive. It had been weeks since the battle for the Velethes homeworld. The wounded had healed, and the dead had been mourned. The Deathworlders and the Velethi had spent that time rebuilding homes, cities, and lives. But they had also been rebuilding something far more significant: trust. It wasn't easy. Trust takes time to grow, especially after centuries of fear and distrust. But the Deathworlders had done what they did best: lead by example. Kale stood at the head of a large table, surrounded by leaders from various systems who had come to seek aid. The Velethi had spread the word of the Deathworlders' bravery and commitment. Other factions, long neglected or oppressed, were beginning to make their way to them. Some came to offer alliance, others to ask for protection, but all came with the same unspoken plea: the galaxy was broken, and they needed someone to show them the way. "The galaxy cannot remain in chaos forever," Kale said, his voice steady, but with a determination that resonated across the room. "We've proven that there is a path forward, a path where strength is not used for tyranny but for protection. This is the future we're building." Beside him stood Makar, his lieutenant and close confidant, who had helped carry out many of the strategies that had led them to victory. The warrior had become more than just a fighter. He had become a symbol of the Deathworlders' code: honor, loyalty, and protection for those who could not protect themselves. Makar looked out at the gathered leaders, some of whom had been skeptical at first, wondering if the Deathworlders would truly stand by their word. But as time had passed, they had seen that the warriors of the Deathworlds were not just conquerors, they were liberators, defenders of the weak. Slowly, trust had begun to build, and with trust came hope. "We will help you rebuild," Kale continued, turning his gaze to each leader. "But we will do it together. This is not a matter of one faction ruling over another. This is a matter of unity. If we fight together, if we stand together, then no force in the galaxy can break us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The Velethi commander, who had now become one of the most trusted allies of the Deathworlders, stood up. His once weary eyes now shone with a renewed strength, a strength that had been born of the warriors' sacrifices. "We owe you more than we can ever repay," the Velethi commander said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Your warriors fought for us, and in doing so, they gave us something we thought lost: hope. We will stand with you. Together, we can create a future where no one has to live in fear again." A few heads nodded in agreement, and the energy in the room shifted. There was a sense of camaraderie, of purpose. They were no longer just individuals fighting for survival. They were part of something greater, a coalition of the willing, brought together by a common cause. Kale smiled, though his expression remained focused. "This is just the beginning. There are many more to protect, and many more battles to fight. But we have learned something important today. Strength is not just about crushing your enemies. It's about standing firm in the face of adversity and helping those who need it most." Over the next few months, the Deathworlders and their new allies began to carve out a new space in the galaxy. The warlords and tyrants who had once controlled vast swaths of territory were now under constant threat. They had learned the hard way that there was something far more dangerous than their own armies: the united front of those who had been oppressed for so long. The Deathworlders had brought them together. The galaxy began to change. Systems that had been isolated and defenseless began to find their voice. The Deathworlders, with their unshakable resolve and commitment to justice, acted as the vanguard of this new era. They weren't the rulers of the galaxy, they were its protectors. But not all was perfect. There were still enemies lurking in the shadows, warlords and forces who had not yet felt the full force of the Deathworlders' wrath. The galaxy was vast, and there would always be those who sought to control it through fear. But Kale was prepared. They were prepared. "There is no peace without sacrifice," Kale said one night, standing on the edge of the command ship, watching the stars swirl in the distance. "We've won the battle, but we will need to win the war. and it will not be easy. His words were true. The battle for peace would be long and difficult, but the Deathworlders had proven one thing above all else. They were unbreakable. They had stood firm when others would have fallen. They had protected the weak, and in doing so, they had become a symbol for the galaxy. The future was uncertain, but as long as the Deathworlders stood strong, there was hope. And that was something the galaxy had never had before. The Deathworlders knew that their mission was far from over. They would fight until every corner of the galaxy was safe. They would fight for the Velethi, for the oppressed, for the weak, for the innocent. And when they were finished, the galaxy would be a place of peace, a place where the strongest warriors defended the weakest, and where no one would ever again have to live in fear. For the Deathworlders, the war was not over. It had only just begun. The stars above glistened like promises yet to be fulfilled, their light cutting through the darkness of the galaxy that stretched beyond the reach of even the most powerful telescopes. Yet within the hearts of those who had borne witness to the Deathworlders' rise, a fire had been ignited, a fire that would not be extinguished. The galaxy was shifting, and the Deathworlders were at the center of that transformation. But the road ahead was fraught with danger. The enemies they had defeated were not gone forever, and new threats loomed on the horizon. Tyrants and warlords, crushed in the previous battles, would return with vengeance, and other factions would rise to challenge the fragile peace. The Deathworlders knew that they could never let their guard down. In a newly established headquarters, Kale stood beside Makar, watching as the galaxy continued to spin, unaware of the silent forces at work beneath the surface. The Deathworlders had become more than just a military force. They were the beating heart of the new galaxy, the ones who had brought hope where there had been none. "You did well," Makar said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 battles. "The galaxy is changing, Kale, but we've only just begun." Kale nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. "We've made a difference, but there is more to do. We've shown them the way, but the galaxy needs time to heal. And healing is not easy. There will be setbacks. There will be sacrifices, but we cannot stop. Not now." Makar stood in silence, his sharp gaze never leaving Kale. He had fought beside this warrior for many years, and he knew the strength and resolve that lay within him. The Deathworlders had been underestimated, written off as savages, but they had proven everyone wrong. They had saved the galaxy's most vulnerable, brought peace where there had been war, and, most importantly, shown the galaxy what true strength looked like. The days following the victory at the Velethi homeworld had been filled with celebrations, but there had been little time for rest. The galaxy's new allies, grateful but wary, needed reassurance. They needed to know that the Deathworlders would not abandon them. Kale and his people had given that reassurance, not with words, but with actions. "It won't be easy," Kale said, turning toward Makar. "The galaxy is full of those who crave power, and they won't give up easily. We'll have to stand strong, no matter the cost." "We always have," Makar replied, "and we always will." The two warriors stood for a moment in silence, contemplating the future that lay before them. They had changed the course of history. They had inspired the galaxy's oppressed and proven that even the most brutal warriors could fight for a cause greater than themselves. But they were not done yet. Across the galaxy, leaders who had once been divided were now beginning to unite. The Deathworlders' victory had set in motion a chain reaction, a new movement of resistance against the forces of tyranny. Systems that had long been oppressed were finding their voice, and it was the Deathworlders who had given them the courage to rise up. Kale and his people had shown them that even the smallest force, when united with others, could stand against the most powerful. But it was not just the leaders who were rising. The common people, once resigned to a life of fear, were now finding hope. The Deathworlders had given them more than just protection. They had given them a reason to believe in the future. No longer would they live in the shadows, cowering before the powerful. They were learning to stand tall. The battles ahead would be difficult. There were still many who did not want the peace the Deathworlders were offering. They saw it as a threat to their power. But the Deathworlders had proven that they were not to be underestimated. They had brought down the greatest forces in the galaxy, and now they would bring down the rest. Kale took a deep breath. This is our galaxy now, and we will fight for it, no matter the cost. Makar nodded. We will. The Deathworlders knew that the galaxy's future was in their hands, and they would not falter. There was too much at stake. The weak would be protected, and the strong would stand guard to ensure that no one would ever again have to fear for their lives. The galaxy would not be ruled by tyrants, and the Deathworlders would make sure of that. With each new day, the Deathworlders stood ever vigilant, watching the stars, waiting for the next threat to emerge. But they knew they were not alone. Across the galaxy, others stood with them. Allies from systems long forgotten, people who had once cowered in fear, were now rising to take their place by the Deathworlders' side. Together, they would shape the galaxy. Together, they would fight for peace. And together, they would ensure that no force, no matter how great, would ever again oppress the innocent. The galaxy was no longer a place of darkness and fear. It was a place of hope, of strength, and of unity. The Deathworlders had fought for that future, and they would continue to fight for it. Because in their hearts, they knew one thing for certain. The strongest warriors defended the weakest, and the galaxy had never needed them more than it did now. The war was not over. It had only just begun, and the Deathworlders would be ready.